OPB Podcasts.
From the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, January 22nd. President Trump's second term hit the one-year mark this week, and surprise, Oregonians and Southwest Washingtonians have divergent takes on how things are going. Today, we're going to hear about what OPB learned when our reporters fanned out to check in with people all over the region. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB politics reporter Dirk Vanderhart.
And I'm Central Oregon Bureau Chief Emily Curitin-Cook.
Emily, fantastic to have you on from Bend. So as you know, on Tuesday, the president marked a year in office that I think by any estimation was eventful, right? Between immigration crackdowns, tariffs, the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, that threat you might remember of National Guard troops in Portland. I mean, last year just brought a blizzard of presidential actions that really impacted the state. I think many of those will continue to impact Oregon moving forward, but you helped to lead this large effort to try to sort of gauge how Oregonians are feeling. First of all, how did you all go about that?
Yeah, so we wrangled something like 9 reporters and sent them out with a task to take the temperature of folks about how they were feeling 1 year into Trump's return to office. So they gathered perspectives across the political spectrum in 2 states, Oregon and Washington. We conducted 20 interviews with voters or would-be voters from cities, small towns, and rural areas. We went from Klamath County to Vancouver, Washington. And a lot of these conversations reflected extreme polarization. No big surprise there. But others led to some introspection and nuances that voters were trying to make sense of the past year and how it's impacted their lives. A few said they feel threatened and unseen in their communities, while others say they're no longer sure what to believe amid this daily onslaught of political news. Thanks, Dirk. So in all, we interviewed these 20 people, and we wanted our cross-section to mirror state voter data. So we drew on 12 interviews with people who didn't vote for the president and 8 who did or would have if they'd been old enough to vote at the time of the election.
Well, and let's just note here, right? Like nationally, Oregon is looked at as a deep blue state, part of this blue wall in the West Coast. But for just about every state, those kinds of generalizations really mask a huge variety of political opinions. Just remind me, because I don't have the figures in front of me, how did Trump perform here in 2024?
Oh, overall, across Oregon and Washington, about 40% of voters went for Trump in the last election. And keep in mind some geographic realities here. But Republican majorities in counties, they cover about 80% of Oregon and Washington by area, even though the people that live there make up less than a third of the total population of both states. So that contributes to this dynamic that you know well, that we've seen for more than 40 years, where Democratic urban voters have kept their party in charge of state legislatures and governor mansions in both states. But as you also know, surrounding these deep blue strongholds, there's a red sea of conservative voters who've long felt ignored by state decision makers. In deep red Crook County in Central Oregon, Jean Egging from Prineville told us she feels like Trump's first year has been productive.
I think everything the state of Oregon does nothing in my interest. It's, Portland, Eugene, Salem, they run this state. They don't really care about the resource production side of the state.
But a few miles down the road in politically purple Deschutes County, Colleen Crawford of Redmond says she doesn't feel seen by her president now.
No, I don't like how he treats people in general. Very demeaning and dismissive and condescending.
So again, these conversations are mirroring this extreme polarization that we see in national polls. And we also find these persistent themes of people feeling threatened.
Yeah, and we often hear in politics, land doesn't vote, right? It is striking to see just how much of the state's actual land mass, votes conservatively, and these relatively small pockets of very dense liberal Portlanders tend to liberal urbanites tend to dictate the outcomes of these things.
Totally. And I mean, one thing I do want to note here is we found a lot of places where people's political views were running against the local grain, either because they're fans of Trump in a blue state or because they loathe him in a red county.
Right.
And we heard this like persistent echo that at best, no one who disagrees with them wants to listen to them, or at worst, they actually think someone is out to get them. I want to play a little bit of tape from OPB contributor Jen Bides when she was outside a supermarket in rural La Pine, Oregon, where like 10 shoppers in a row turned her down for interviews. And then this happened.
We're just talking to people across the state to ask how they feel about this first year of President Trump's second administration. Not wanting to talk about it.
Wait a minute. I might get shot out here.
Oh, no.
If I express my real opinion.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, that guy said he feels like he'll get shot if he says what he really thinks. And then, of course, he just kept walking.
So, I think we have touched on, it is not a surprise, of course, that people are going to have different views on this president. I do want to try to drill in a little bit more to the folks OPB spoke with who voted for Trump, who support him. I mean, were there broad similarities in how they viewed the last year?
Definitely. Overwhelmingly positive for the most part, even for people who said, I don't like everything he does. I don't like, a couple of people told us, I wish he would talk less. I wish he would be a little quieter and not, antagonize people. But we asked all these folks to sum up Trump's performance over the last year in a single word. And here's how some of the folks who voted for him responded.
Powerful.
Order. That would be one strong word.
I see him as a sort of a savior. I mean, it's kind of a miracle in a way,
That's James Walden of Gilchrist, Oregon, Anthony Martell from Canby before that, and Joel Parkins from Kelso, Washington. Now, Walden from Gilchrist, and just to note, he's not related to Oregon's former long-serving GOP Congressman Greg Walden. James Walden sees a huge disconnect between his political beliefs and the politics of the state, and that rankles him even with a Republican in the White House. He told me that Oregon Democrats, quote, don't consider me as even existing, even though I've been born and raised here. And he describes the president's first year back as, to use his word, wonderful. He was a fan of the intervention in Venezuela, which he viewed through the lens of a crackdown on the drug trade.
Yeah, I mean, we mentioned up top some of the things that the president did. I didn't get into that foreign policy stuff. We're dealing with Greenland right now. There's the Venezuela thing. He bombed Iran. What other things did you hear from folks that support the president? Were there specific things like Venezuela that his fans seem to bring up most or more?
But just setting aside his fans, immigration and immigration enforcement was top of mind no matter the political affiliation. Here's a bit of tape from OPB's Eric Newman interviewing Joel Parkins of Kelso, Washington.
What do you think is President Trump's biggest accomplishment so far?
I love what he's done on the international level. I love that we've closed the borders.
And so walking in that very same park on that same cold January afternoon as Parkins, Eric also found Christopher Neubauer of Kent, Washington, who called Trump a great businessman, but also said running for president was his biggest mistake. Neubauer was really troubled by the rise in immigration arrests and deportations.
Well, the Bible teaches us to love thy neighbor like thyself. And if we're simply going around collecting people and sending them over to back wherever we think they're from, and separating from families and love, I think that goes completely against what the Bible is teaching us. So.
And immigration was also weighing on Brenda Nathan and her husband on the Warm Springs Reservation in rural Central Oregon.
Anybody that has brown skin has to be concerned. I printed out both of our birth certificates and I carry it in my wallet.
Yeah.
She's concerned she could be swept up in an immigration enforcement raid just because of where they live and how they look.
Now, we're hearing some of this. I mean, OPB also spoke with a lot of people who did not vote for Trump, did not support the president. Obviously, they were less charitable about what has happened the last year. We've heard some of it. I guess generally, broadly, what did we hear from these folks?
Well, let's just hear it from them. Here's how a few of the people who did not vote for Trump put the last year in a nutshell.
Crazy, insane.
I would say chaotic.
Terrifying.
So that was Brenda Nathan from Warm Springs, Oregon, once again, and her husband, Randy Nathan, before that, and Christopher Neubauer of Kent, Washington, who we heard from before. And they were all among the majority of voters in their states to reject the president's second term.
And, when you talk to them, is it immigration again? You mentioned that came up a lot. When you hear about things that people oppose Trump really brought up most often, what did we hear?
Well, yeah, immigration, definitely a recurring theme, but also the president's overall approach to power and using Congress was a big one that came up a lot. People we spoke to who don't like Trump said over and over they feel like he's overstepping his authority and isn't honoring constitutional checks and balances.
Okay, we are going to take a quick break in the podcast. We'll be back in a moment with more from Emily's reporting. Okay, we are back. Emily, it is a cliche that American politics are polarized at this point. We've heard a lot of that already. One thing you all examine a bit in your recent story is the danger of reducing people to just their choice of president. Can you talk about that a little bit and what you learned or heard in chasing this down?
Yeah, once I listened to all these different opinions, I feel like I needed to ground myself in some perspective, both on the media and on human psychology. So I talked to media expert first, Joy Mayer, about this. And she says that under the surface of all this polarization and of, people being red or blue, there are these quieter, more nuanced views that can be difficult to access, either because people didn't vote or because they don't want to talk about politics at this point. Here's Mayer.
I think that one thing we all often get wrong is making viewpoints binary. The real danger for all of us is assuming that because we know one thing about somebody, that we know everything about them. We know how they voted, and so we know all these other factors.
She says reality, as you probably would be surprised to learn, is often a lot more complex than that.
Well, and I think there were some obvious commonalities among people OPB spoke with. They weren't necessarily heartening to folks like you and I who work for a media organization, though.
No, they weren't. No matter what people said they believed about the president, a really common experience we found was that they feel distrustful of national news outlets, and they're exhausted by the difficulty of distinguishing truth from lies. And this can have real impacts on people's engagement. Student Andres Romero of Oregon City says he's opted out of news altogether.
I don't read news articles or watch the news because it's all very doomsday oriented. If it's important, somebody that I know will tell me.
And other people we talked to had turned to unconventional sources like YouTubers, or they're trying to, pull from different outlets that they see as having a particular bias and then reconcile the truth by, finding the differences between them. Or they're looking at foreign media like the BBC. And in one case, a resident of Christmas Valley, Oregon, told us he only listens to Trump himself at this point if he wants the truth.
Okay. Well, it is an election year, Emily, and, Oregon will not be voting for president, but we will be selecting our governor in what I think is pretty much assured to be a bruising election. I think it's going to likely pit Oregonians of different political stripes against each other. That seems to be what happens here and elsewhere. Can you give me some hope here? Are there things Oregonians can do to work to bridge divides, bring the temperature down, something that is going to unite us and at least not make this as acrimonious a political year as we might otherwise see?
I did go on this quest, Dirk. I was like, how can we fix this? And I talked to a social psychologist at OSU Cascades in Bend about this. Christopher Wolsko directs the university's Lab for the American Conversation, which is all about doing research and experiments that are meant to help people have productive conversations about these really divisive issues. And one of his big research areas has been the psychology of stereotyping and prejudice. He says if you look at prejudice, you pretty much never see these intractable long-term conflicts without what he calls symbolic threats. And the way he put that is like someone waves a flag or they mention climate change and we just go bananas and lose our minds and see them as a threat to our particular identity or belief system. And Wasco says his lab has found Americans actually do still have a lot more in common than they have apart. But the case is that more and more of our experiences and actions are tied to this sense of threat. So he says the first step that that you can take toward overcoming that is to really listen deeply, to kind of set aside those triggers, the flag or the words that might make you think you know everything about someone, and set those aside and really listen and really try to understand where people are coming from.
Yeah, and that requires that we engage with people in the first place. So that sounds like the first step as well. Well, and I guess that requires us in the first place to inquire about people's views more broadly and not just judge them, based on what we see. Emily, you also spoke with people whose views are not crystallized. I mean, people we spoke with have changed their preferences or how they're looking at presidential politics over the course of Trump's time in office.
Yeah, actually, OPB's Antonio Sierra went out to Hermiston in Eastern Oregon and talked with a man named Jose Garcia. And Garcia voted for Trump in 2016 because he hoped the president's economic policies would help his own small business. But Garcia says that didn't happen. And now his views of the president have shifted. They really revolve around immigration enforcement and what he sees as the targeting of communities in Democratic majority states.
Yeah, the laws need to be enforced, but we're doing it the wrong way. This is like the retribution. It's not. It's like getting even. This is not retribution. Is not democracy. It's hate, and I think we're harvesting a lot of hate.
And so Garcia says that for him, the antidote to this hate is to keep listening to his neighbors. He says he's going to be a lot more careful with his vote in the future. He didn't actually even vote in 2024. After supporting the president in 2016, he was among the nearly 40% of eligible voters in his county, Umatilla County, that didn't cast ballots at all in the last election. So it'll be interesting to see in the midterms if folks like him come back out and vote differently with their views shifting.
Very, very interesting. Let's leave it there. Emily, thanks so much for joining us from Bend today. And a huge shout out to all the reporters in the OPB newsroom who fanned out across Oregon and Washington to get a sense of how people are feeling.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Dirk. And thanks to the whole newsroom for giving us a slice of what people are feeling out there.
This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gert Boyle studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.